We are going to get started. It's an exciting story that we have to tell, has many roads, many pathways, many fascinating accounts. I mean, Jesse has done a magnificent job at documenting lives of the political life and culture to some extent of Cuban migrants to New York City and after the 1870s and into 1904 or so, especially in forming networks of collaboration with intellectuals engaged in policy and political issues. So these networks will reach density, and they will be able, according to his account, Jesse's account, to shape Cuban racial relations as defined by Marti. Am I on the right track?
Sure.
In terms of making Cuba a distinct case in which blacks, if you want to use the term, Afro-descendants and other Cubans have a more integrated, what word would you use? Closer relationship.
Yeah, they created a coalition is what I would say.
Creating coalition. It's a fascinating story. He takes us, and I took the liberty of putting in the program, you want to read this, I inserted, or we inserted with his inspiration, an announcement of one of those Cubans who is a musician, Pastor Peñalver. And you can see in the program he's playing at the Harriet Tubman Neighborhood Club in 1912. It's later. But this guy is in his account. Yes. He's engaged in the political networks, forming relationships, and impacting Marti and others. So it's a fascinating account in New York City, the distinctive climate, and distinctive opportunities for networking, and the role these guys play. We have had approaches to racial relations, distinctive racial relations in Cuba from different angles. And now notice a famous anthropologist had a cultural emphasis on transculturation, that the emphasis there was on culture. Those focus on political conditions inside Cuba, they kind of give emphasis to the relations between the rebels in Cuba and the Spaniards and the different factions. And then, of course, the emergence of Afro-descendants in Cuba, former slaves and others, in the army, Liberation Army with Maceo and others. So that's another line of research which has been advanced in the last few years. Jesse is not denying any of that. He's really documenting in a very thick, dense, exciting for me way what's happening in New York City and how the guys who came to New York City were able to shape up a sense of groupness and influence through relations with Marti and others, the whole path of Cuban racial relations and political transformation. It's a fascinating account, can take us into all kinds of side stories. So, Jesse, I don't want to interrupt you. I'll take more of your time. So
Thank you. Yeah, so I think I'll stand. But thank you so much, Mauricio, and thank you to Rosalina for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. What I've learned, this is the second book that I've written, academic book that I've written, and what I learned after the first one is that you don't write them very frequently, so it makes sense to take a minute and tell the world that you've written them. So I'm going to tell you that this book is now available at bookstores on Amazon. As of today, actually, it's now actually shipping from Amazon. It's a labor of love that I've been working on for 12 years now. And so I'm really happy to be able to be here in New York. This is the first time I've talked about the book in New York since it's out, or anywhere really. And I'm just happy, really grateful to all of you to come. So on a bitter cold evening in January of 1890, on the first floor of a row house on a poor street near Washington Square, a group of immigrants gathered in two wallpapered rooms. And this is actually a photograph of the actual house. It's the second from the right. It's the second house in from Thompson Street on West 3rd Street. Doesn't exist anymore. 74 West 3rd Street near the corner of Thompson. Most of the men in attendance at this gathering had already spent the day rolling tobacco in New York City's cigar factories or cooking and waiting tables at the restaurants that catered to cigar workers. The women had spent the long day sewing, washing, keeping house, and tending the children who now sat on their laps. In their spare time at gatherings like this one, they had also found ways to become readers, musicians, teachers, poets, journalists, and revolutionaries. On this evening, they were gathered to inaugurate a new organization called La Liga, an educational and recreational society dedicated to the welfare and uplift of Puerto Ricans and Cubans of the, quote, class of color. This was the class to which almost all of those in the audience proudly belonged. Illuminated by gaslight and heated by a small coal stove, the apartment held a piano, a table and chairs, and a bookshelf with the works of Plutarch, Spencer, and Renan, as well as books of history and poetry in Spanish. The crowd sat in rows of chairs that stretched through the open double doors connecting the two rooms, and as on many evenings, the group directed its attention towards a speaker, a handsome man with dark brown skin and elegantly shaped sideburns. A framed portrait of this man also hung by the door of the flat. His name was Rafael Serra. A cigar maker by trade, Serra was also a self-taught journalist, a teacher, and a politician. He was the secretary of La Liga and the leader of the community that gathered there. No one yet used the term Afro-Latino, not to mention Afro-Latinx. In Cuba, where slavery had been abolished 4 years earlier, and Puerto Rico, where slavery had ended only 13 years before that, officials referred to the people in this community as negros, morenos, pardos, and mulatos, words that expressed varying degrees of blackness and intermixture. English-speaking New Yorkers typically called them Cuban Negroes, if they noticed them at all. In the great swirl of humanity that descended on New York in the late 19th century, they were a tiny current, numbering in the hundreds in a city that was home to hundreds of thousands of newly arrived immigrants. Understandably, their experiences hardly register in classic accounts of New York City immigration, race, and urban politics. Yet the stories of the worker intellectuals who gathered around Rafael Serra in Greenwich Village are, in the term coined by my colleagues Rebecca Scott and Jean Lebrard, microhistories set in motion. Their stories provide a singular window onto the world through which the migrants moved. The men and women who gathered at La Liga that night boarded steamships to cross the narrow expanses of water that separated the islands from one another and from the rising imperial power to the north. They experienced firsthand the varied systems of racial domination created in each society in the wake of slavery. As settlers, they negotiated New York City's evolving color line and straddled the porous boundaries between Latin American migrant communities and African American communities. So their stories have a lot to tell us about how those boundary lines evolved and how they came over time to seem natural. Their stories also have quite a bit to tell us about the history of race and revolution in the Caribbean itself. Serra and his supporters used the resources, networks, and insights that they built as migrants and settlers to intervene in nationalist politics, especially the Cuban and Puerto Rican independence struggles. Indeed, a second speaker shared the spotlight with Serra at the inauguration ceremony that frigid night in January of 1890. This was the Cuban poet, journalist, and diplomat José Martí, who was a white man. His portrait hung opposite Serra's near the door of the flat. Now, after Martí's death in 1895, in the final war of independence against Spain, the revolutionary poet became the most celebrated hero of the nationalist cause. He became known as the father of the fatherland, the apostle of liberty, the martyr of los rios. But when his path crossed with Serra's for the first time in the 1880s in New York, Martí had only just begun to assert himself in the exile community, hoping to gather the disparate and often mutually suspicious elements of the nation into a single democratic movement under his leadership. Martí helped Serra to create La Liga and taught night classes to the worker intellectuals who gathered there. And these classes covered topics ranging from political philosophy to classics to composition. In return, Serra and his comrades became Martí's earliest and most active supporters in his bid to become the leader of the Cuban revolutionary struggle. So as a result, it was largely in conversations with members of La Liga that José Martí created his famous approach to the question of race. Following their lead, he disavowed the reigning international scientific consensus about black inferiority. Racial division and inequality were the product of social prejudice, not nature. The revolution would avoid class and racial conflict by ensuring the inclusion of all Cubans in a just social order. The struggle against Spain was an effort to secure a republic, quote, with all and for the good of all. Serra also worked with Marti to reassure wealthier white Cubans, many of whom worried that a revolution might unleash a black rebellion on the island, that black Cubans were ready to forgive the sins of slavery and, quote, forget their color. In a free Cuba, they argued, there would be no whites and no blacks, only Cubans. Serra and his supporters helped Marti to create and refine this message, and then they helped him to broadcast it to Cubans of color on the island and to working class Cubans and Puerto Ricans of all colors in New York, Florida, Jamaica, and other exile centers. After Marti's death in 1895, Serra became the leading proponent, or one of the leading proponents, of the idea of a nation for all, which he framed as a defense of Marti's doctrine. After Cuba became independent, Serra and his allies helped to organize black participation in the new system of electoral politics in Cuba. Serra himself returned to Havana, where, campaigning as a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Marti during the revolution, he twice won election to the Cuban House of Representatives. So for decades, scholars in the field of Latin American studies have engaged in heated debates over this kind of political trajectory. Should the promise of a society that would transcend race be celebrated as an effective strategy for pursuing social justice, or should it be debunked as a cynical myth, a tool for stifling independent anti-racist activism? There's a long story here, but I'll just shorten it down to the idea that gradually an unstable consensus has begun to emerge, that this is not a question of either or, but rather both and. The idea of a nation for all had many variants, and most functioned in ways that could sometimes support anti-racism and sometimes repress it. My goal in the book and in my talk today is not to reopen that debate, but to come at it sideways. Scholars working through the complicated terrain of Afro-Latin American studies and Afro-Latino politics typically adopt a comparative frame. We emphasize that race as a social construct operates differently in different locations. And we seek to draw out the differences between the ways that it works, for instance, in Cuba or Puerto Rico, and the way that it works in the United States. We resist the temptation or the tendency to imagine as normative or natural the ways that race does work in the United States. And in fact, I think increasingly we resist the idea that race only works in one way in the United States. By emphasizing the local conditions of racial formation, we conceptualize the dynamics then of Afro-Latino and Afro-Latina racial identity as the product of encounters among differing systems of racial meaning produced in these different local contexts. So for good reason, we highlight and demarcate a contrast between the ways of organizing racial politics that evolved in the United States and the ways that emerged in Cuba and other parts of Latin America. For instance, few accounts of the independence struggle fail to mention the affection that Marti and his black and brown allies expressed for one another. And whether these are recounted in order to celebrate them or in order to debunk them, the tellers tend to imagine that this relationship was something that was essentially Cuban and entirely distinct from how relationships worked, how political relationships worked in that other society up there to the north. But what I want to ask today is, what if the objects that we are trying to compare were never quite so far apart in the first place? What if the alliance between Serra and Marti has not simply to do with their Caribbeanness or their Cubanness, but also with their experience as New Yorkers? So what I want to do today is suggest a complication to the comparative frame. I don't want to abandon the comparative frame, but I want to complicate it with what I will, for the lack of a better name, call a transnational story of race. I want to refocus our attention or our conversation about the ideal of racial transcendence onto the migrants who gathered near Washington Square to hear Serra and Marti speak on that cold January in 1890. Why did Serra and others accept the call to demonstrate patience and forgiveness in the name of national unity? Why did they choose to promote the idea of a nation for all as if it were Marti's idea rather than their own? How did they manage to assert themselves in the nationalist struggle without giving up their right to form independent associations or to demand equal treatment as people of color? I argue that the answer to these questions are not to be found through yet another exegesis of Marti's extensive writings, but rather through attention to these migrant microhistories in motion. by digging up what we can about the questions: where did they come from? How did they come to settle in New York? And what was their experience of migrating while black in the United States in the aftermath of Reconstruction? The result is a picture of a migrant world in which contact with African Americans and other African descended peoples were extensive, and in which cross-racial coalition building was not only simultaneous with independent race-based activism, the two forms of politics were actually mutually dependent. So my argument is twofold. One, that the stories of the men and women who built this community, who built the institution of La Liga and others, did so largely in response to their experience as black migrants in the Gilded Age of New York. And two, that attention to their community, the community that they built, can dramatically alter our view of the revolutionary politics of the Spanish Caribbean. This is an argument that's been decidedly shaped, and in fact probably has only been possible because of what scholars have called the practice of history in the digital age. I am old enough to cling to an image of myself as a researcher who patiently transforms documents into notes on site and then spends hours trying to piece them together into a story. And those notes and those documents are supposed to belong in physical buildings that actually have the word archive written on their stony facades. But despite this view of myself, the story I will tell you today is based almost entirely on research materials that were collected on rather hasty trips to such buildings with a camera and a tripod. And it is based on much more frequent trips to the department scanner with books from interlibrary loan, and that is not the worst of it. I am loath to admit just how many excursions I have taken through that ubiquitous portal of our age, the search page, into the depths of HathiTrust, Google Books, and full-text newspaper databases. Or to own up to the obsessive reliance I have made on genealogy websites built by that juggernaut of modern historical practice, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. I've also been extremely fortunate to receive support from my institution for experiments with new kinds of digital tools and to make sense of the data available on genealogy websites and elsewhere as social history. In this book, I think probably it was the right choice, I've chosen to call almost no attention to these questions of process and method. Such discussions in any event tend to lose their power in the transition from scrollable, full-color digital display to fixed black and white pages. My goal has been to create a lively and engaging tale centering on the personalities, conflicts, poetry, politics, and even music, which I guess is actually a shared interest with Mauricio, which I've learned today. But today I want to pull the curtain back just a little bit and share a little bit more about the methods that I used to come up with this story. I will not offer any guidelines or pronouncements about digital methods, but with your patience I will do a little bit of show and tell. If any of you are interested in discussing with me my thoughts about the broader implications of the practice of history in the digital age, I'm happy to do so in the question and answer or informally after the conversation. So being a dutiful historian in the digital age, I will, of course, begin with a projected image of a document. And I hope can you see this a little? You can see it a little bit. I'll explain what it is. This is a record of the moment when Rafael Serra, the future member of the Cuban House of Representatives, petitioned before the Superior Court of New York to become a citizen of the United States. It consists of a printed form with language attesting that Serra met the requirements for naturalization, he was of age, he had resided in the United States for the requisite period, and it had been his bona fide intent to become a citizen for at least 2 years. It also includes some handwritten information about the petitioner, his address, his occupation, his former nationality, and his signature. So in what remains of my time, I want to present you with 5 ways of reading this document, using each to build my argument about the evolution of Cuban racial politics in New York, and in a couple of instances I'll also pull back the curtain a little bit and talk about the process of answering the question. So chapter 1, Revolution. The first reading begins with a lesser detail. The petition for citizenship took place on October 10th, 1888. And for some of you who are Cubanists or Cubans, it's not a lesser detail, right? So the clerk of the court, this was likely a mundane fact. Just one thing to be scribbled on a total of 800 naturalization petitions that were filed on that particular day. But to Serra, it would have had deeper meaning because this was the 20th anniversary of the start of the nationalist uprising known as the 10 Years' War. That insurgency had ultimately not been successful in throwing off Spanish rule, nor had it been successful in ending slavery, the 2 goals of the movement. Yet on October 10th, 1868, the day of the uprising, remained a sacred day in the nationalist calendar. And every year in New York, Cubans gathered to celebrate the anniversary. And Serra definitely knew this because he had been part of the group that since the early 1880s in New York had been trying to rekindle the rebellion in Cuba. He had actually volunteered for an unsuccessful expedition to the island in 1885, serving under Antonio and José Martí and others. and receiving a commission as lieutenant and spending 18 months battling boredom, hunger, biting insects, and canal fever in Jamaica and Panama while waiting for a deployment that never came. So declaring loyalty to the Constitution of the United States might seem like a strange way for a Cuban revolutionary and nationalist to commemorate the most important patriotic holiday of the year. Yet the choice can be explained in part by returning to the document itself and noting in particular the language of the transaction. Serra, in fact, did not have to forswear his Cuban nationality in order to become a United States citizen because Cuban nationality did not actually technically exist yet. Instead, he declared, and I quote, "I do absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure, and I will renounce all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, but most particularly to the government of Spain." So this was not only an easy hurdle for a revolutionary like Serra, it was actually an entirely appropriate gesture to take on the 10th of October. So this brings us to our second reading of the document, citizenship. Within the United States, with our particular mythologies around immigration and assimilation, it is common to understand the act of naturalization as a momentous shift in effective allegiance. Indeed, this was probably the understanding of the presiding judge who confirmed Serra's naturalization, seeing the position as an act designed to leave behind foreign origins and become a citizen of the United States, to become an American in his vision. But Serra may have placed the emphasis differently, seeing the petition as a mechanism for renouncing his status as a colonial subject deprived of political rights to become a citizen of a republic, not necessarily to express a definitive shift in national sentiment. The point was to be a citizen rather than to be an American. Indeed, quite aside from the symbolism of rejecting the King of Spain, the decision to naturalize seems to have been deeply intertwined with Serra's continued investment in Cuban politics. At the time, he was the New York correspondent for the newspaper called La Fraternidad, the leading publication for the class of color produced in Havana. He and other future members of La Liga had also organized a committee to distribute the newspaper in New York and to raise funds to purchase a printing press to send to the editors in Havana. And one of the main questions that was being debated in La Fraternidad in the fall of 1888 was the issue of black suffrage in advance of the elections for municipal offices in Cuba in 1889. Those elections would take place in January, it was October. At the time, property requirements excluded most men of African descent from voting rights in the Spanish Overseas Empire. Of course, women of all racial backgrounds and identifications were not allowed to vote either. Writers in the newspaper called on the few eligible men of color to register and vote in order to demonstrate the capacity of black and brown men to be active citizens of Spain, and, though they could hardly say so openly, in a future Cuban republic. So the point was, anyone who could register to vote ought to do that to demonstrate and prove that there was no reason to prevent everyone else of this racial identity from voting. And indeed, Serra's own writings in La Fraternidad in this period suggest that when he went to naturalize in the United States, he was doing precisely this, taking citizenship to show that black Cubans could be trusted with that responsibility. Serra described the activities of a group in New York that he called the Cuban American Republican Association or the Cuban Republican Club. He had helped to create the association to support the presidential candidacy of Benjamin Harrison. And this suggests that he went to the courthouse in October in order to acquire, for the first time in his life, the right to suffrage, which he would exercise the first Tuesday in November, 3 weeks later, or 4 weeks later, and thereby to intervene in the debate in Cuba over the capacity of black men to exercise such rights. His goal was to become a citizen of a republic, not necessarily to express a shift in national allegiance. Again, for someone who saw the projects of republicanism, racial equality, and national independence as inseparable, this would have been a totally appropriate gesture to undertake on the patriotic date of October 10th. So the opportunity to renounce as well his loyalty to the King of Spain was probably just icing on the cake. Oh, I'm sorry, this is an image of La Fraternidad, which I forgot to show you. Chapter 3 is politics. Yet at the same time, the Cuban American Republican Association was also a political organization in practical terms. The word Republican referred to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, not the ideology of republicanism in the abstract. And this provokes a question that could only be answered by rethinking our approach to the digital repository. In the digital age, it's really easy and fast to find genealogical documents. So for example, I was able to find the document we've been talking about in about 30 seconds of searching on Ancestry.com. Just type in Rafael Serra and look in the naturalization records and you can find this and you can all download it in almost no time. But that document arrives, as my colleague Laura Putnam has warned us, totally disassembled from the archive that originally had produced it, from the institution that originally produced it and the archive that holds it. So we don't know what all the records that surround this document look like, and as Laura Putnam has warned, we're left without the benefits of contextual browsing of what she calls artisanal history. So in the old days, I would have had to go to the archive, and to find this document, I would have had to leaf through a whole bunch of other documents, and I would have learned all kinds of things about the world in which this document was produced that by just downloading it, I didn't learn. Yet, as Putnam herself notes, not all is lost. The search function on Ancestry.com is not designed for social history research or for browsing, but it is possible with some experimentation to create intentionally non-specific searches to retrieve, for instance, as I have done, all of the persons of Spanish nationality who naturalized in New York City and Brooklyn courthouses between 1872 and 1888. That's a total of 2,056 records. And the resulting data does indeed provide useful context for that particular moment when Serra went to naturalize. And here is one way of looking at that. This is a graph of all 2,056 naturalizations graphed over time. So the x-axis are months and years, and the y-axis are just the number of naturalizations that happen in any given month. And as you start to look at this, I'll explain what I see in this graph. You can see that there's a very regular pattern. There's a fairly low level of baseline naturalization activity, punctuated by great bursts of activity, which I will tell you, if you can't see it from this far away, almost always happen in October of election years. Right? So most notably, October 1876 gets you here, but then you see every 4 years there's another blip all the way up to 1888, and in the off years, which are congressional years and sometimes also state election years, there's a smaller blip. So there's less activity, but there's still clearly activity in the moment right before an election. So this means that Serra's naturalization in October 1888, in addition to all the other things I've already told you, was part of a much broader pattern in which Cubans acquired United States citizenship in order to participate in electoral politics in the United States. And so the question then arises, is there any way with this set of methodologies to figure out how commonly Cubans of African descent, Cubans like Serra, were included in or not included in or excluded from this larger pattern of registration for voting or for naturalization for voting? And the answer is that using Ancestry.com, there's not any direct way to do that because the naturalization records in this period don't include race or any mention of race on them, which is probably better historically in terms of the racial politics of the time, but it can be frustrating for historians because we'd like to know. But let's consider another detail in the naturalization record, which might get us indirectly to this question. The name and address of a second cigar maker, a man named Jerónimo Bonilla. Because identity documents were not readily available in this period, courts in the United States basically they couldn't ask for IDs, so they just relied on the sworn testimony of a second person when you went to naturalize. If you went to naturalize, someone else had to come and swear that you were who you said you were. So Bonilla appeared in court with Serra to attest, again in formulaic language printed by the clerk of the court, that he knew Serra, that Serra was of good moral character and disposed to defend the Constitution of the United States, and that his claims to have resided in the United States for the requisite period were accurate. This is interesting because Bonilla was, among other things, the secretary of the Cuban American Republican Association. Serra was vice president. It is also well documented within nationalist historiography, that the address that Bonilla gave on his visit to the courthouse, 74 West 3rd Street, was the address that would about 6 months later become the headquarters of the educational society called La Liga. This was the wallpapered flat on the poor street near Washington Square that I described at the beginning of this lecture and that I showed you a photograph of. So at Serra's side, Bonilla was one of the principal organizers of La Liga, and in fact, you've already seen a picture of him. Here you can see him blown up. He was already in that image that you saw of the members of La Liga. So for Serra, naturalizing was not a solitary act, but one undertaken in the company of a second black Cuban cigar maker who was also a close ally in nationalist politics. So this suggests another way of analyzing the larger group of naturalization records in the aggregate. Using software designed to create visual representations of relationships, I, with some help from the friendly tech support at my library and digital visualization specialists, was able to map the relationship between all of the individuals seeking to become naturalized citizens in New York in this period and all of the people who served as their witnesses. The result is a single dot or node for every individual who appears in any of the 2,000 records. No matter how many times they appear, they only show up as one dot. And then a line with an arrow pointing from all of the witnesses to all of the naturalized subjects. So I've also color-coded the nodes according to the listed occupation of petitioners and witnesses, because that's another piece of data on these records. So red here represents high-status occupational categories who actually were the majority of the Cuban emigre population in New York in this period: merchants, brokers, planters, engineers, physicians. Yellow represents cigar makers, and dark blue represents other working-class occupations, such as waiter, porter, or cook. And I just want to point out that the yellow is a kind of a little bit of a flexible category, fungible category here, because it's very difficult to determine from these records whether someone is putting the word cigars down because they work as a laborer or an artisan in a cigar factory, or because cigars is their business. And I made the error, since I'm really interested in class politics, I made the error of not presuming that one or the other. So everybody is yellow there. So there may be fewer cross-class alliances than it would appear from this if we disaggregated the people who are actually upper class, even though their cigars is their business. So you can see here in general that there are many cases, actually 808 of the 2,056, where the naturalization record provides only a single dyadic relationship. There's one witness and there's one petitioner. And in the ones that are sideways, they were actually witness and petitioner simultaneously for each other. And the others, there's just one witness who comes and shows up for one petitioner. But there are several more who are part of small clusters in this range where there's one witness for two or three petitioners. But the remaining 800 individuals, which we can see closer up here, naturalized in the company of only 72 witnesses. And these witnesses testified on behalf of anywhere from 4 petitioners to a stunning 172 up there in the left-hand corner. One witness, 172 petitioners. And that, well, I'll talk more about him later, but he continued after 1888 and naturalized more folks too. These witnesses testified on behalf, I already said this, okay. In thinking about what the picture tells us, we can imagine witnesses as community resources. They were persons with professional skills, such as notaries or teachers. They had longer residence in the United States, or they were fluent in English. So migrants more newly arrived or less well-educated likely sought out their help in managing these unfamiliar and possibly frightening or complex transactions. But given the timing of these naturalizations, right around and just before key elections, we can also think of the witnesses at the centers of these clusters as active shapers of political networks. Rather than waiting to be asked for their help, these witnesses probably rounded up other migrants and shepherded them to the courthouse to naturalize. They likely collected them again several weeks later to deliver them to polling stations. So I'm happy to return to this image in the question and answer period, but let me offer 3 broad observations for now. The first, and we can call it point A, is that almost every one of these individuals were men, a proportion that far outstrips the overall demographic structure among migrants, even though that structure did skew towards men, not nearly as much as this. And this likely owes to the structure of the US immigration law at the time, which granted derivative citizenship to the wives and daughters of men who naturalized, and yet denied the right of naturalization to women who were married to non-citizens. Recall, too, that if the primary reason for naturalizing seems to have been for voting, voting was not something that was available to women in this period. So there was no incentive in that sense. There was no parallel incentive to round up women and get them to naturalize. This does not mean at all that women were not important in the evolution of this migrant community and political movement, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to uncover and trying to relate in the book the different kinds of community relationships that centered on women. And I had some success, but none that produced an image quite like this one. Point B, so that's point A. Point B, so point A is almost all of them were men. Point B, these clusters seem to divide into 2 principal types, organized by social class. Most of the large clusters seem to represent networks composed primarily of men and a very few women of high social class, depicted in red. Working class exiles, depicted in blue and yellow, most frequently naturalized within their own networks, especially this particularly impressive cluster mobilized by a white cigar maker named Agustin Yorca. This is a really interesting guy who doesn't appear anywhere else that I've been able to find in the printed record or the archival record, except as the person who took 178 working class Cubans to naturalize. So here's a close-up of that network, in which you can see that I have identified individuals whose names that I know from other sources. Petitioners or witnesses whom I know to have been men of African descent and to have taken part in the political and social networks led by Bonilla and Serra appear as diamonds rather than as circles, and I hope you can make that distinction out. So this leads to conclusion C. Beginning with the election of 1876, Cubans of African descent were largely integrated into the working class network of naturalization that was organized principally by Agustín Llorca. In fact, many and perhaps most of the men who became Serra's constituents in the Cuban American Republican Club in 1888 already had significant experience of inclusion in Cuban American electoral politics as voters in the previous election cycles. So here's a close-up of that network in which you can see that I have identified individuals whose names I know from other sources. I've told you this. So beginning in 1876, Cubans of African descent were largely integrated into this working class network of naturalizations organized principally by Llorca. In fact, most of them probably were already citizens before they gathered around Serra in 1888. So let's return to that moment. This image shows only the naturalizations filed in that particular courthouse on that particular day, October 10th, 1888. And you can see that Bonilla was the witness not just for Serra on that day, but actually for 3 other men as well. A man named Marcelino Piedra also served as a witness for another man named Pablo Beato. And this is important because both Piedra and Beato were members of the executive committee of the Cuban American Republican Club. So you have the vice president, the secretary, and 2 members of the executive committee all going on this same October 10th date to the courthouse. The documents don't say whether they came together, but it is my presumption, I think it's not an unreasonable speculation that they all went to the courthouse together at that time. It's possible also, obviously, that Bonilla made 4 separate trips, but I don't think so. And actually, Bonilla and Piedra went several more times that week, and you can see here, this is the broader cluster of naturalizations over the course of those weeks in 1888, and I just included one extra cluster down here, which is the third cluster includes the man who was the president of the Cuban American Republican Association, who naturalized a few years earlier, but I just thought it was interesting to think of that whole subsection as a single network in which all of the officers of this political club are involved. His name is Germán Sandoval. So we can see that our hypothesis seems to be correct. The clusters of witnesses and petitioners seem to represent projects or networks of political mobilization. In this case, a cluster is very clearly representing a network of political mobilization within the Cuban American Republican Club. And what's unusual about this small network, of all the ones that I've been able to look at, is that although black and brown men were included in many of the networks, or at least a few of the networks, this is the only one in which they were the leadership and not simply also the followers. So this is the only network in which the witnesses I can identify as of African descent, not just the petitioners. So naturalizing and voting was something that black and brown Cubans in exile had done for more than a decade in the company of white working class comrades. And when Sandoval, Bonilla, and Serra created the Cuban American Republican Club, the point was not simply or primarily to gain access to the vote for their constituents. It was rather to mobilize voters within a novel form of political organization, one in which all of the officers were black men. The point of creating the club was not just to create new voters. The point was to foster black political leadership.
For Cuba or for the U.S., or both?
Yeah, they're in the U.S. They're trying to do this within the Republican Party, but I think it carries over quite significantly into the kinds of politics they practice when they also are practicing Cuban revolutionary politics. Okay, so now let's turn to Serra's naturalization and to our 4th way of reading the naturalization document around the question of place. And here it is worth risking a sideways glance through the looking glass of full-text searching. This is something that many folks who have written about research in the digital age warn us about, because the best way to get a decontextualized document is to take a break from your own research and just look someplace else by a full-text search and see if you can find something. But I think it was worth it in this case, because Serra in his writings in La Fraternidad, reports on the party organization, and he claims that the club, the Cuban American Republican Club, had made quite an impression on the local political establishment in New York. He noted, for instance, the Cubans had received frequent favorable coverage in the American press. And in the digital age, through sideways glancing, it is very easy to check up on this claim, which I did over the course of several obsessive afternoons of full-text searching in newspaper databases. But in fact, as a result of that, I can tell you that only a single newspaper in New York, of all of those that are text searchable, actually reported on the Cuban American Republican Association. And this was the New York Age, the leading African American newspaper in the city, and actually the leading African American newspaper in the United States at the time. Indeed, the Age frequently reported on the activities of the Cubans of African descent, and typically referred to Serra and Bonilla in ways that suggest that they were figures well known to the city's African American readers, or at least to African American journalists. In these reports, it is clear too that the Cuban American Republican Club, from the perspective of the Age, was one of our clubs, which is to say it was an institution loyal to New York City's African American Republican establishment. And here we arrive at the last of the digital rabbit holes that I will drag you down this afternoon. As we have already seen, because each naturalization record contains the names of two people, they are ideal sources for tracing and mapping social networks. But because each record also has two street addresses, one for the witness and one for the petitioner, we can think about those social networks not just as relationships, but as relationships that can be mapped along spatial dimensions. And this is especially significant for a story about the evolution of race-based and cross-racial politics, because space and race were connected in 19th century New York through the workings of the residential color line. So the first step down the rabbit hole is easy. So here you can see the two, on one slide behind, I'm sorry, you can see the two addresses suggest that there's a spatial dimension to this relationship. So the first step is easy. Here are the men who naturalized on October 10th, 1888, and their witnesses. And here's the same group represented against the backdrop of a fire insurance map from the period. This is southern Greenwich Village. I've also added two other individuals who I've introduced at this point, one of whom is Agustin Llorca, the man at the center of that massive cluster of working class naturalizers. And the other is Germán Sandoval, the president of the Cuban American Republican Club, who lives down here on 89 Thompson Street. And that apartment that he and his wife Magdalena lived in is a really important place that I'm not going to talk about now, but is in the book, all through the book. All of these men lived in the part of Greenwich Village south of Washington Square. This is an area that, as historians of New York well know, referred to at the time as Little Africa. But the nickname actually does not tell us much, except that some New Yorkers at the time imagined this to be a disproportionately black neighborhood. In the digital age, though, I could download microdata, including the place of birth and race, for every resident in Manhattan as enumerated in the 1880 census. I then found that colleagues at Brown University had created a file with the geolocation of every building address in the city. That is to say, the coordinate, the longitude and latitude of every building from 1880. And then by combining these sources, and with some help from a master's student working on the project, I was able to calculate the ratio of white and black residents in each address in the city, and then I could plot that data onto the fire insurance map of Greenwich Village. And then data librarians could help me to tweak the maps and answer some more questions and polish the presentation. And this is the result. On this map, buildings that appear in white had 0 residents who are identified as either black or mulatto on the 1880 census. And just so you know, those are the terms that actually existed on the census. The United States was counting those categories separately at the time. Buildings in black had no residents identified as white, and the other shades represent the different proportions of white and non-white residents in the mixed buildings. This, to my knowledge, is the first attempt to map racial segregation building by building in New York in the 19th century. And it shows something that my colleagues at Brown had already just demonstrated statistically, that prior to the Great Migration of the early 20th century, there were no majority black neighborhoods in New York. Even in neighborhoods that were reputationally black, like southern Greenwich Village with the name Little Africa, black residents were still a small share of the population, generally between 5 and 10% in the neighborhood. The color line is therefore impossible to discern at the level of the census tract or of a enumeration district or even at the level of a city block. But racial segregation functioned nonetheless at an extremely local level. Landlords and neighbors excluded people they identified as black from most buildings in the cities, forcing those renters into inferior apartments at inflated rates. Those buildings tended to be clustered together, but the clusters themselves were scattered. So while African Americans lived in majority white neighborhoods, they lived in buildings that were on average 70% black. White New Yorkers lived, with only a few exceptions, in buildings that excluded black people altogether.
Are you saying that in Midtown, downtown Manhattan, Cuban blacks were the beginning of black neighborhoods?
No, but they were in those black neighborhoods at the beginning, is what I'm saying. Yeah, so they were probably Cuban-born people of African descent were probably only about 1% of the total African descended population of New York at the time, but they were significantly they themselves were not typically living among white Cubans. They were typically living in those spaces that were reserved for African Americans. And I'll show you. I'm going to show you here. So if I put the men who went to naturalize on October 10th, 1888 back into the picture, you can see that that's in fact the case. Those arrows are almost all pointing towards buildings that we have been able to determine were occupied 100% by people identified as black or mulatto by census takers. And here we have a closer look, and you can see that this is actually really helpful to understanding an unusual pattern of community formation that was the context for cross-racial politics among working-class Cubans in New York. Serra and Sandoval and other members of the Cuban Republican Club lived in close proximity to Yorca. Here is Yorca living in an all-white building, and here are the rest of them living in all-black buildings, but they're really right close by. And in fact, they lived very close by to other white Cubans among whom they worked and organized, and with whom many of them naturalized. And for those of you who want to see this in 3 dimensions, we can do this because we have a photograph. There are Jerónimo Bonilla's house at West 3rd Street and Agustin Yorca's house on Thompson. And there you can see them in the photograph. That's how far away we're talking. Right? So those are people living in segregated spaces, but very close to one another. But if the highly localized color line made it possible to live in close proximity to the white Cuban New Yorkers with whom they participated in some forms of politics, as Cubans who looked black to landlords and neighbors, Bonilla, Serra, and Sandoval faced the same color line that confronted African Americans in the city, and therefore almost invariably lived in buildings that were predominantly or exclusively black. And Bonilla's home at 74 West 3rd Street in this map would seem to be an exception, but note that this map shows residential segregation patterns in the 1880 census, and Bonilla didn't move there until 1888. So in fact, I've been able to confirm through other sources that by the time the Bonillas moved to 74 West 3rd Street, it was the home of a prosperous African-American couple, Charles and Harriet Reason. So Bonilla also lived, and La Liga held its meetings, and Marti gave his speeches in a residential space shared with African-Americans. Of course, living in close quarters does not necessarily build feelings of solidarity, as any of you who now live in cramped multifamily apartment buildings probably know. Yet this pattern of settlement is helpful in thinking through their political organizations, including the Cuban American Republican Club and Serra's act of naturalization from the perspective of place. Statistically speaking, the most African American block in New York was Sullivan Street between West 3rd and McDougal. It's circled here, around the corner from Bonilla's flat and from the headquarters of La Liga. In addition to a black-owned grocery store, by the early 1890s, the block was home to a barber shop owned by a black Cuban, and a restaurant owned by another black Cuban, the man who succeeded Sandoval as the president of La Liga. It was also the location of the Bethel AME Church, the Bethel American African Methodist Episcopal Church, the largest black church in the city. And in fact, African American papers in the city reveal that by the middle of the 1880s, Cubans of color had begun to hold funerals in this building. This is the building here, right here. The barbershop is here. The Cuban restaurant is here on the corner. So Cubans in the network that would build La Liga are already holding funerals in that building. And in December of 1886, the preacher there, the Reverend William Derrick, had invited the resident Cubans of the city to his church to hear him lecture on the topic of, quote, their acceptance as citizens in America and their advancement and thrift as active, busy people since their exile. Most likely, this speech included a call to those who had not yet to become citizens and vote Republican, because Derrick was an important figure in the African-American hierarchy of the Republican Party in the city. As one critic wrote, Reverend Derrick never hesitates to tell his people, singly or collectively, how to vote. He considers himself the guardian and flock guide of his flock, and far from having cause to regret his course, is rated a man no politician can afford to ruffle, for he controls thousands of votes. So how does the theme of place help us read the naturalization document in a different way? While there is good reason to think that Serra and Bonilla set out on their independent political endeavor, the Cuban American Republican Association, for reasons of their own, related to the debates about citizenship in Cuba and to the structures of leadership in the multiracial Cuban exile community, they undertook this project in a place that was marked by an idiosyncratic but no less brutal color line that put them in close quarters with African Americans as well as with white Cubans. And as a practical matter, they depended upon the resources of the African American Republic establishment to create their political club. Indeed, they probably depended on Derek or someone very much like him, and in exchange, they may well have delivered their votes to him. To this point, we have 4 overlapping ways of reading the moment when Serra went to the courthouse to naturalize on the anniversary of the rebellion begun on October 10, 1868. He did so to renounce any loyalty to the government of Spain and to make a claim to full manhood citizenship in a democratic republic. He did so in coordination with a group of his supporters who, in addition to organizing to distribute and raise funds for the newspaper La Fraternidad in Havana, also constituted the leadership committee of the Cuban American Republican Association. This club served as a mechanism for intervening in the debates about the capacity of black men to be responsible citizens in Cuba. 3, though black and brown migrants had naturalized and voted for decades, the political club served as a mechanism for mobilizing black voters in support of black political leaders, especially Serra himself, who would later become one of the most successful black politicians in early Republican Cuba, a member of the House of Representatives. And 4, the men who created the club lived in the sharply segregated neighborhood of Greenwich Village and built the club, like other independent institutions they created, in close alliance with the African Americans among whom they lived. This is the texture of the migrant world that, as I told you at the beginning of my lecture today, seems to me fundamental to rethinking both the early outlines of Afro-Latino settlement in the city and also to understanding more fully the coalitions that brought José Martí to the head of the Cuban independence movement and canonized the ideal of a nation that would transcend race. Now, scholars, including myself, have tended to see that kind of cross-racial nationalism, that kind with which Martí has become a symbol, as existing in contrast to, and at some level, basic level, in tension with, racially based organizing, especially racially based organizing across national communities, black internationalism. We've tended to frame our comparisons between the race politics of the Spanish Caribbean and the United States around the idea that these two approaches to anti-racist organizing, one based on a raceless unity and the other based on strong racial identity, are incompatible. And we have tended to see this incompatibility as a major obstacle to the formation of alliances or coalitions between Afro-Latino and Afro-Latina people and African Americans in settings like New York. But for the people who first joined Martí's coalition, these two ways of organizing racial politics did not seem incompatible at all. Nor could anyone imagine the alliance with Martí as a barrier to meaningful relationships with African Americans. This brings us to the final way of reading the document. The date that Serra and Bonilla chose to go to the courthouse was not just the anniversary of the first rebellion in Cuba, it was also the date of the first major nationalist event in New York organized under the leadership of José Martí. Although Martí had lived in New York since 1880, he had only recently emerged as a contender for leadership in the nationalist movement. He argued that the first step in preparing for the war was the creation of a single democratic movement that could repair relations among what he called the mistrusting and varied elements of the exile community: military veterans and civilians, wealthy merchants and cigar workers, and of course, blacks and whites. The anniversary celebration on October 10th, 1888 was his first opportunity, Martí's first opportunity, to create a public forum in which to enact and perform the unity that he had begun to describe, to, quote, knead the dough of the future republic, as he put it. For Martí, this meant not only inviting Cubans to attend as members of the, Cubans of color to attend as members of the audience, but also putting a man of color on the platform as a speaker, preferably one who could help to attract an audience of Cubans of African descent who were, with very good reason, suspicious of many in the nationalist movement, including Martí himself. With this in mind, several weeks before the anniversary, Martí sent, for the first time, a letter to Rafael Serra, the local correspondent for the newspaper La Fraternidad and the vice president of the Cuban American Republican Club. He explained his conviction that the event should, quote, be born from all and should belong equally to all. On this principle, he implored Serra to participate in planning the commemoration and eventually gave him a place among the speakers at the event. Which means that on the same day that Serra applied for national naturalization in the company of 6 members of a political club that he had created to promote black leadership, a club that was affiliated with the African American Republican movement, he also appeared on stage as a black Cuban who as part of a movement that would commit itself to racial equality and in that context was willing to forgive the sins of slavery and forget his color. It is hard to imagine a clearer example of the point that these two forms of politics operated simultaneously. But I want to suggest that in addition to being simultaneous, the two kinds of politics were connected. I suggest that Martí did not invite Serra to speak despite the fact that he was active as an organizer of independent race-based politics, affiliated with the Black Republican Party in New York, I believe that he invited Serra because of this organizing. Serra was not just an attractive symbol to be held up for white and black audiences as an honorable black patriot. He was a party operative, able to mobilize those communities who lived across the color line from Marti into a multiracial political coalition. He became the hinge between independent racial organizations and the new kind of party, Cuban party politics that Marti had begun to imagine. Recruiting Serra meant creating space not just for black participation, but also for black leadership. But a commitment to black leaders was something that at that point could only be put into effect by fostering organizations that would actually elect black men as their leaders. So the incorporation of such independent institutions into his Cuban Revolutionary Party is the kind of coalition politics that we need to make visible in order to better understand the rhetoric of racelessness that the movement deployed. It was a raceless movement that nevertheless recruited and depended upon race-based organizing. And that coalition politics, I hope that I have convinced you, can also only be understood within the migrant world that produced it. Here then we can return to the questions posed at the beginning of my talk. Why did Serra and the others accept the call to demonstrate patience and forgiveness in the name of national unity? Why did they choose to promote the idea of a nation for all and with all as if it were Marti's idea rather than their own? How did they manage to assert themselves in the nationalist struggle without giving up their right to form independent associations or to demand equal treatment as people of color? The answer to these questions are not to be found in the intricacies of Marti's writings, in the varied and evolving influences on his philosophy, or in the many accounts of his personal brilliance, but instead in the social worlds built in New York City by artisan intellectuals and black migrants over 2 decades. Men and women in the social world did not just support Marti, they helped to create him, drawing upon a complex terrain of interconnected political commitments that were in play on this single extraordinary day, a day when Serra led a group of black and brown constituents to naturalize as US citizens and become Republican voters, published an article in the most important Havana newspaper for the race of color, and stood for the first time beside Marti as the only black speaker at the patriotic gathering in Clarendon Hall. Thanks so much. I really look forward to your comments.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. One of the conclusions that I reached is that we have to bring Jesse back to New York to join CUNY and pursue this line of research. Great research line. Network, micro research, life stories, meetings, associations, neighborhood, space, what else? Culture,
Music, poetry.
politics.
Yes. I have a question. I did not notice until seeing the paper article referring to a newspaper called La Fraternidad.
Yes.
But it's a very important name because it's the name of the Masonic organization in New York that primarily agglutinated Cubans until the creation of La Universidad, which primarily was populated by people from Spain. And I wonder, given the social values, the values of brotherhood that Masonry espouses, I would imagine that would have served a great purpose in this political objective here in New York. Can you?
Yes, I'm totally in agreement. I mean, one of the other places where the language that the movement ends up drawing on around brotherhood and anti-racism comes directly out of the Masonic movement, which I can trace because I have access to some of the liturgies, the Masonic liturgies from the 1870s, in which the liturgies themselves require members to recite words that say all divisions that are not based on people's individual merit are against against humanity and justice. So there's definitely that link. There's also a really interesting parallel to that, because even though all the Masonic lodges, or many of the Masonic lodges, had that logic in them, nevertheless, the Cubans who end up creating this network also create their own lodges that are allied with the African American Masonic movement. So there's both things are happening at the same time. Yes.
Are these people that you mentioned tonight, how many of them were Freemasons?
Almost all of them. Almost all of them.
Which lodge did they belong to?
So they belong to their own lodges. They created a lodge that was part of the Prince Hall Freemasons, which is the African American Grand Lodge. It was called the Sol de Cuba Lodge, which actually then changed its name later to be the Prince Hall Lodge in New York. And Juan Bonilla and Jerónimo Bonilla, they were the leaders of that, and they were also members of a second lodge, which was not a Masonic lodge, but an Oddfellows lodge. But it was again affiliated with the Grand United Order of the Oddfellows, which is the Black Oddfellows in the United States, and that was called San Manuel.
Questions? Yeah.
Yes.
I I know you're saying Masonic and lodges and all that. Does that imply there's a certain amount of, is it just freedom of communication, or did that really mean that the communication had to be very specialized?
Inside a Masonic lodge, you mean?
Yeah. Because what I mean is, I know they're all educated and they have political purpose,
Right.
but what I mean is, they're in New York now, so does that imply this total freedom of the American?
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
Freedom.
Well, so, I mean, they're definitely, the Spanish government is definitely employing spies and private detective agencies to spy on the Spanish movement in New York. And of course, the United States isn't really a space of freedom for African descendant people in this period, not to mention working people in general. Like this is the period of lynching, not happening directly in New York, but Serra is still in New York in 1901 during the anti-black riots that happened in the Tenderloin, right around where he's living, right? So yes, there are some things that they're able to do, like they have freedom of association to a degree. They have the freedom to become citizens, and that actually protects them to a degree when they travel back to Cuba. But they also experience the limits of American citizenship, and particularly they're here for the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. They're here for the civil rights cases in the Supreme Court. They're very close with the leading civil rights lawyers in New York, who are taking cases against racial segregation and the separation in public spaces in New York. And they're in constant conversation. They know exactly what's happening here. So they both experience freedom here, but also experience limits of freedom. And they imagine, I believe, a republic that can do better than that.
So I'm missing the connection between Puerto Rican.
Yeah, so they're not really in this talk that much. If you look at the image, the person in the middle, in the center of the image with the mustache, that's Sotero Figueroa. The way the book is, so one of the really interesting things about this movement is how important a very few Puerto Ricans are in it, and how consistently the Puerto Ricans are important in the movement at large, the Cuban movement at large, are Puerto Ricans of African descent.
So were the Puerto Ricans then become part of America, and that causes the division to be political?
Oh, I see. You mean after 1898, when Puerto Rico is absorbed into the United States and Cuba is allowed to be semi-free?
So does that cause the shift or the rift?
No, I don't think that there is a big rift between the Puerto Ricans of African descent and the Cubans of African descent in their organizing. I think they do end up in two different political systems, but many of the Puerto Ricans who are in New York end up going to Cuba and either lose their lives in the struggle, or some of them stay and actually get involved in Cuban politics. And the others stay in New York, and others go back to Puerto Rico. So but I don't see that there's a rift. The biggest issue is that the war never comes to Puerto Rico, right? So the very frustrating thing for the Puerto Rican activists, most of whom are by that time living in Harlem in the late 1890s, is that they're participating in a movement which is supposed to be two wings of the same bird, but the bird's only flying in one direction, right? Or the bird's Cuba. Yeah. Yes.
Bueno, soy Gisela Arandia, lo siento, pero mi inglés no es fluido, así que puedo hacerle las preguntas en español.
It's a Cuban professor who is visiting, and he should use Spanish.
¿Cree usted, tengo tres preguntas, ¿cree usted que con la investigación que ha hecho, que Estados Unidos incidió en cierta manera junto a lo que se ha dado en llamar el independentismo moderado, en que el proyecto martiano fracasara? La segunda pregunta, que en cierta manera es un comentario: en Cuba Rafael Serra no es muy conocido, excepto Walterio Carboner, mi profesor, que siempre me insistió en que era un pensamiento decisivo para poder analizar esa relación junto con Marti, aunque hubo momentos de cierta discrepancia. Y la última pregunta es si usted cree, esto es una transición epistemológica a la actualidad, ¿cree usted que la famosa frase cubana que se dice siempre como el argumento político fundamental, cubano es más que blanco, más que negro, más que mulato, tendría una vigencia en el siglo XXI en el contexto de Estados Unidos? Muchas gracias. Y perdone.
No, gracias a usted. Do you guys want, should I translate those questions and then
Yes,
answer?
please.
¿Usted va a entender si yo contesto en inglés?
Sí, sí.
Okay. So the first question was about whether or not the United States intervened. The United States, we know the United States intervened in the war in Cuba, right? A war that the Cubans had almost won against Spain, that had been organized in a very complex coalition in which the people that I'm talking about today were part of the coalition. So were, as Mauricio mentioned, the military leadership, many of whom were of African descent in the military, and then so were also very wealthy elite Cubans who had different kinds of goals for the movement. And the question is whether when the United States intervened, they intervened in a way that would favor the moderate independent outcome rather than the revolutionary independent outcome. And I think absolutely, there's no doubt. And if you read what Serra was writing in 1899 and 1900, 1901, he's saying this, although I would say one of the interesting things about Serra is that he became, when Marti died, he became most closely allied with Estrada Palma. Right, so the first president of Cuba, who was oftentimes identified rightly in Cuban historiography as the kind of hand-picked choice of the U.S. administration, the person who had enough nationalist bona fides to be able to be acceptable to the nationalists in Cuba, but was pretty pro-empire, that is the person with whom Serra was had the closest alliance in Cuban politics. So it's much more complicated than, because of the way that Cuban politics worked out, even the moderates needed black allies, and some of the even most critical and bright, sharp-thinking black thinkers needed allies in the political system and compromise with the moderates. But yes, I think absolutely the United States did everything it could to prevent, most importantly, they limited suffrage in the first two elections held under U.S. rule, right? So in the municipal elections, and then in the Constituent Assembly, they did their best to try and prevent radicals from getting into those offices, and they failed. And so both of those elections, despite the limits on suffrage, the radicals won, and then the United States threatened that if the the revolutionaries created full universal manhood suffrage in the Constituent Assembly, that the United States might not withdraw, and they did it anyway. Right, so this was a big victory for exactly the people who had been first working in the Republican Party to develop how you build coalitions, and then had deployed those coalitions in the Cuban Revolutionary Party, so that by the end of the revolution, even the more conservative revolutionaries understood that the political system included trying to convince black people to vote for you. Like, even if you were a racist white person trying to win power from another racist white person, both sides needed black people to vote for them. So, I mean, it's not the best outcome, right? I appreciate this question about Serra not being that well known, and I wonder about it too. I think in general, it may just be that the Cuban Republic, one of the downsides of the success of the logic of Cubans are not black or white, was then the forgetting of all the black Cubans who were involved in it. And it's very interesting because at the very end of the movement, this group, they had created a couple of political clubs in the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and the last meeting that they held in 1898 of the Club Guerrilla de Maceo, right? So that means the guerrilla of Maceo, the most radical of the clubs in New York, all run by black men who had been in part of La Liga. They have a meeting there. They say, okay, we're closing up the club. The last act we're going to do is we're going to donate all the materials we've had for our club, the desk, the pen, the minutes book, to the National Museum. And it's so poignant because they expect, or maybe they hope, that the National Museum will set up with an exhibit about them. But of course it never was. There's national museums, but there's no exhibit about them. They're completely forgotten in this. And I feel like the publishing that they all did, the ones who had access to printing presses, as I was going through this, it seemed to me that they were leaving a trail of crumbs or of clues for people to come along after. And I think the generation of the 1940s did that, and they wrote biographies of these folks, and then the generation of the 1970s did it again. Cubans of African descent did it again, and came back to these lives. And I really feel proud to be able to be part of that process, even though I'm not Cuban or Afro-descended. So I think those are your questions. Was there?
Sí, la vigencia del.
Right. Is the ideal that these folks worked out, as complicated as it was, of a nation without race, is that appropriate to the current political situation in the United States? I have to say, I don't think it's for me to say, but what I can say is that I started working on this book. When I started working on this book, Barack Obama was president, and there were a lot of people talking about the United States was beyond race, and so it was a book about earlier experiments at doing that would highlight some of the problems with those experiments and also the incompletenesses of it. But I ended the project in a moment when there's white nationalism openly mobilizing to divide working class people in the United States. And I was forced to remember that the people who invented this system were doing it against a backdrop very similar to that, right? So they didn't necessarily imagine the Cuba without races as the ideal world, but they had imagined it as a world that was better than what was evolving at that moment in other parts of the Atlantic world, which was white nationalism tied to white supremacy. Yes?
There were 2 points that you made in terms of dichotomies that I was wondering if you could say more about, or perhaps say again.
Okay.
Because it went by too fast.
Oh, sorry, okay, yes.
And I couldn't get them. One had to do with the way race politics were done here and there.
Right.
And could you say more about
Yeah.
that? And the other dichotomy that you mentioned was whether Marti was following or was being made
Right,
by,
yes.
by these groups. And they struck me as very interesting ideas, and if you can say them again,
Absolutely,
I
yes.
at least would appreciate it.
So not only did I say it quickly, but I also only I'm scratching the surface of a really long, deep history of the way that people have thought about comparing the racial politics of anti-racist movements in the United States and in parts of Latin America, in which the kind of the basic outlines tend to be that the anti-racist movements that have had the most participation in parts of Latin America tend to be multiracial movements that have as one of their platforms anti-racism. So like the Cuban Revolutionary Struggle, like the Cuban labor movement, like the labor movement in Brazil, or other similar kinds of movements. And the United States, the most effective and in some ways the most prominent anti-racist movements have tended to organize around racial belonging, right? So that's not to say that there aren't multiracial formulations in the U.S. labor movement or that the civil rights movement wasn't multiracial at moments, but that the idea that this can either be seen as, depending on who's talking, as an advantage to one or the other. But my point is that I myself, when I first came to this project, was really interested in people who had started out in the Cuban movement and then ended up in Black internationalist movements, so Pan-Africanist movements. And at first I thought, I have to explain how they transition from one kind of politics to a whole other kind of politics. One kind of politics says, we're all Cubans, we forget our race. The other says, we're all Black, doesn't matter what nation we're in. That seemed to be a complete dichotomy for me, and some of the characters in the book move from one to the other. I end the project thinking that actually those are not a dichotomy for the people at the time, that it's possible to do both on the same day, right? And that was powerful for me. And so in some ways, I'm not lecturing the rest of the field so much as lecturing myself about the way that I used to think about these politics as being somehow not incompatible. I think that seems, it has seemed to me that way, but it doesn't seem to have been the case for them. The other question is the question about whether Marti in some ways led this group or whether he followed this group. And I think what's novel about the book is the argument that they may have helped create him. So I've certainly emphasized that element. It's not actually the way they tell the story. They chose to tell the story, especially immediately after Marti died, as if he was a Christ-like figure who had taught them, brought this knowledge to them, and that they were then disseminating it. But I see that as strategic. I see that as a way of continuing to say things that I know they've been saying since decades before they met Marti, but now saying it with the protection of a figure who was being canonized. It wasn't actually necessarily certain that he would be canonized, so I also think that they did a lot of work to make sure that he would be, to make sure that a lot of people who never really liked Marti's leadership and were really glad to be rid of him because he was so connected with the working class, wanted to take control of the movement, and some of them would have liked to remember him as having been deranged and overly radical, and it ended up not being the case. It ended up being that all factions claimed to be defending Marti, but I think that's why I put the emphasis on them creating him. And I particularly am interested in, and I'm willing and waiting to hear from the folks who are, this was not a book about Marti, right? So it's very easy to see their influence on him in this book. I'm waiting to hear back from folks who are really Marti specialists as to whether or not they think that I make the case, or whether they think that I'm just missing whole other aspects of his life that are going on here that are not happening. But I really didn't want it to be a book about Marti. It just sort of came around to being about this.
By the way, the book, where is the book? In that side? Yeah, make sure this side also gets to the
Yes?
During the time of activism of these Afro-Cubans in New York, were they in relationship at all with race-based Afro-Cuban organizations in Cuba?
Oh yes, absolutely. So La Fraternidad, that newspaper that they were writing for, that is the main organ of what is the Directorio de Sociedades de Color in Cuba, right? So the main civil rights activism in Cuba is going on. I mean, there's civil rights activism going on all over. Even the Spanish loyalists have some activist civil rights activism. But the main institution is this umbrella organization called the Directorio, which tries to comprise and create a single organization to represent all of the black clubs across the country. And the New Yorkers have clubs that are affiliated with that, and they also go into the press in both New York and in Cuba to defend the idea of the Directorio. And it's very interesting because they're living on the same blocks as the first African Americans who are imagining the same exact kinds of society groups. In fact, the Cubans created the Directorio a few years before the African American New Yorkers create the Afro-American League, which has exactly the same function. So, and that's the precursor to the NAACP. So they're absolutely thinking about, writing about, talking about the possibility of that kind of activism in both places, and they simultaneously will deploy their ability to raise funds, which is one of the freedoms they have in New York is that they have jobs, and the jobs pay dollars. So even though they're not rich, they're not as poor as they would be. So they're collecting money all the time, and they send the money to buy a printing press for Juan Guadalupe Gomez, who's the leader of the Directorio de Sociedades de Color. And then when Gomez is attacked by folks who say he's trying to create a race war or a race party, they go out into the press and they defend Gomez. And they actually, I think, are the ones who also tell Marti, you have to go into the press and defend Gomez. So Marti goes and says, I'm against racial organizing, but I'm in favor of Gomez. I'm against racial organizing, but I'm in favor of Serra, which is a really interesting tension and dynamic in that.
What happens to them after the
What happens to those organizations?
Things like the Directorio, do they continue being active?
They do, yeah, they do. Many of them end up being folded into the new political system, in which most of those, because there's universal mandatory suffrage, those then become the place where when you're trying to collect voters, either you go to the old ranks of the military where you have all kinds of structures for mobilizing voters, or you go to these clubs, and that's one of the reasons why national white politicians need to have black leaders who can actually vouch for them for the clubs, and that's how Serra gets elected to the House of Representatives. He is a figure who the working class and Afro-descendant clubs of the eastern part of Cuba see as their representative in the government.
Yes, it's good. I think it's useful to notice that both Rafael Serra and his daughter Consuelo returned to Cuba,
Right.
the Cuban Republic, after 1902. They died in Cuba. Also, Sotero Figueroa.
Yeah, who's Puerto Rican by birth, but yes, he goes to Cuba as well.
They end up in Cuba. They die in Cuba. They have very interesting lives. Consuelo founds a school in Arroyo Naranjo, which trains the kids of Eliseo Diego, the children of Eliseo Diego. There's a very moving account of that school, private school, and integrated in Cuba. So she applied whatever she learned at Hunter. She learned at the university, and then she went on to found this private school for, that's very telling, isn't it? And so the question for you is, what does that tell you about the passion? It's true they're joining two paths, US and Cuba. In the end, they go back to Cuba.
Well, so yeah, so
You're transnational.
Serra goes back to Cuba. Consuelo and Gertrudis, who's Consuelo's mother, who was a midwife, she was one of the first African-descended women to receive a degree in midwifery from the University of Havana, which was not an easy thing to do. And she was also the granddaughter of the founders of Cabildo Lucumí in Matanzas. So it was a really interesting female figures from her grandmother, Rita del Monte, to Gertrudis Heredia, who's the leader of the female groups in New York, and she helps the women to give birth. And then the daughter who gets a degree at Hunter College and goes back and is actually a really important intellectual and educator in Cuba.
So what does that tell you about the passion, about the agency of these people?
Well, so some of them go back and some of them stay, and so the Bonillas Juan goes back, and then he gets a government job. He works in the customs office for a while, and then he comes back to New York, and he's mentioned in the memoirs of Bernardo Vega as being one of the old timers in New York when Bernardo Vega arrives, as is Pilar Pivalo, who was a Puerto Rican woman who had been married to a Cuban, although Silvestre had passed away already. So some of them do stay, and even the ones who go back to Cuba are in constant contact with African American, like Frank Guridy writes about in the later period. The fact that they're colonized by the United States is a big part of that, but so is the fact that they already have all of these transnational ties with civil rights work in the United States.
Fascinating, yes.
Yeah, so my question is about Máximo Gómez and his involvement in the Cuban revolutionary struggle in New York City.
Yeah.
Does he travel here? Who he's meeting with and his relationship?
Yes. So Máximo Gómez, for those of you who don't know, is a famous general in the Cuban struggle, both the 10 Years' War and then also the kind of the highest ranking military general in the final War of Independence that he was born in, the Dominican Republic. And yes, he was here. So the expedition that, it's actually a fun or sad story. The expedition that Serra went on in 1885 was organized by Maceo and Gómez. It's called the Maceo Gómez expedition. And they came to town and they stayed on West 9th Street in a hotel owned by a French woman who had been in Cuba before, the Grifo Hotel. And they had meetings, and one of the meetings they had was actually a real hostile meeting between Gómez and Marti, which is sort of famous, but also sort of not talked about because it's really hard to square these two heroes who became thought of as heroes later. So Marti broke with the nationalist movement at that point. He doesn't really come back until 1888. And the rich Cubans who were going to give the money for the expedition, they decide not to give that money. And so Gómez and Maceo try to go to war with just the support of the workers. Gómez buys all the military supplies and he sends them to Santo Domingo because his cousin has a position in the government there. But after they get the materials there, that government falls. And all those materials get taken by the new government. And suddenly all the money that they collected from all the workers in the United States is gone, and they've got these 50 expeditionaries waiting in Jamaica for all their rifles and supplies, and they can't do it. So Gómez went to Santo Domingo to try and get it back, and he ends up in jail in Santo Domingo. They never get that stuff back. Maceo has to come back to the United States, tour all the same factories and say, you know what, funny story. Could you maybe give us money again? And the workers give them money again, and then this actually becomes a really terrible story. Then Flor Corambet takes all that, puts it on a boat, takes it to Jamaica, and when they get coming into Jamaica Harbor, the captain gets skittish that they're going to get boarded and throws all the material overboard again. So that's the reason why that invasion never happened. But so Gómez was here, he was involved, and there actually also are other Dominicanos who are in the movement at different places. There's a member of one of the local clubs here. One of the clubs of Afro-Antillanos was Marcos Rosario, who speaks at all of the meetings, and he's clearly Dominican. And then the man who creates the first biography compilation for Rafael Serra is Lorenzo Despradel, who I don't know much about him, but I know he was Dominican. He was living in Oriente, Cuba, and he was a printer. And he's the one who collects almost all the later biographers of Serra depend on the documents that he published when Serra was running for office. So there you go. And also Marti goes through Santo Domingo on the way to so there's a lot there. Thanks for the question.
By the way, yes, what's the name of that hotel in New York?
Grifo.
Grifo.
Yeah.
It's worth, somebody should do a dissertation or a book on the Hotel Grifo. How many of you know the Hotel Grifo? Oh.
Yes.
So many of the people you've studied were cigar workers. Can you talk about that social network?
Yeah.
Was it similar to Miami where the Cuban, did they have a union life?
Yeah.
The politics in the union?
Yeah.
Were their coworkers black and white? Was the just Cuban union? Or
Yeah.
Yeah, can you-
Those are fantastic questions. So the difference between Key West and here is that in Key West, the industry is almost all Cuban, right? So the people who own the factories are Cuban, the people who work in the factories are Cuban, the tobacco is Cuban. It's so close to Cuba, and the Cubans are so involved in the local politics that they also control the customs house, so they can kind of move stuff in and out at will. In New York, not only is it a huge city with only a few thousand Cubans living in it, but also there are like 15,000 cigar workers in New York in this period, of which only 500 or 600 at any time are Cuban, or Cuban and Spanish, and yeah.
The best ones.
Well, so that's where I'm going. I wasn't going to say the best ones, but what's happening in New York at this moment in the 1870s and 1880s is that is the largest industry in New York, because at the time it's a huge mass consumer product, and the manufacturers are trying to speed up the process. They're trying to de-skill the process and move from hand rolling to machine rolling, and they're trying to shift work from male workers, most of whom were German and Bohemian, to women and children, who they basically pay almost nothing to work in their own tenement houses in this mechanized process. And that generates the labor movement, which has a massive strike in 1877, and that gives rise to Samuel von Burst, who was a cigar worker, and the creation of the American Federation of Labor. The Cubans knew about that. They had some relationships with the beginning of the AFL, but the AFL was a pretty white male union, and the argument was we white male workers should have the prerogatives of white maleness and keep everybody else out, and take that, bosses. So it wasn't a super welcoming place for black cigar workers. There are two other union formulations there. So where the Cubans and Puerto Ricans are working are in a select group of factories, which mostly are owned by Spanish and Cuban owners, but there are some German owners too. And they get a niche. It's like, we're going to sell $2 cigars. We're going to import high-quality Cuban tobacco. We're going to import Cuban workers. We're going to do the old-fashioned hand rolling. So they really have the old-school artisan. You roll 1,000 cigars, you're going to get paid $45 for the week, which is pretty good work. But but especially for black men in New York at the time. And there's a question that I have not been able to fully answer, but I have some. I mean, I did ask the question: if they're living in segregated buildings, are they working in integrated shops, right? And it seems to me that by the 1880s, I'm pretty sure that they are. And in Cuba, there are still before the end of slavery, there are still people who are enslaved working in shops. So they're integrated shops, but that doesn't mean that they're racially progressive shops, right? In New York, it seems that by the middle of the 1880s, there are probably still some shops that do have fewer black workers and some that have more. The networks that get people into the shops are probably somewhat racially structured, but it seems like they're mostly integrated by then. And the unions are split between Spanish and Creoles and not around race. So in fact, that split, and then afterwards the split between both unions who turn more towards anarchism and the nationalist leadership who don't like anarchism, and so those splits, I think, actually build more cross-racial alliance. So I think 1876, when you see that spike and Yorka starts to build that cross-racial alliance, I think that comes out of an antagonism to the bosses, right? We're no longer gonna have those bosses as our patrons in the political system. We're gonna create our own networks, and those networks are the first real cross-racial networks that I see in New York.
Julie, and then you.
Thanks so much. That's really great. It sounds like, just to understand a little bit better, your argument about how the people from La Liga and Serra may have shaped what he's thinking.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're doing a little bit of reading against the grain of what was stated and interpreting them in the context of their previous actions. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair, but I also think that, so I mean, where I see this, the way I see this work is that I think that Marti comes after having broken with the movement in 1885. Marti, I mean, this is not me. This is, pretty much all the biographers on Marti see him as being not really connected to the nationalist movement until 1887, 1888. Yeah. And he comes back, and as far as I can tell, and what I have access to is limited to what is in the published record. The first, before he really makes much headway in building a movement again, he gets very involved in La Liga. Right, so he's there for a couple years before anything really starts to pick up steam again. That's not to say that he doesn't have other relationships that he's building at the same time, but it's clearly one of the first relationships. So before he's traveling to Tampa and Key West, these famous meetings with the workers there, he's got 2 years of learning how to talk to workers. He'd never been somebody who talked to workers before, as far as I can tell. He had not been in the early 1880s or when he was in Mexico somebody who would have been identified as being a racial progressive any more than any other Mason at the time. He was not the person who was going, and reading in factories. He was not the person who was giving night classes until he gets to La Liga. And then I think that there's part of the transformation in his social thinking is because of his observations in the United States, which is well known, right? That he observes the hate market affair, and by the end of that, he changes his mind. He observes the campaign of Henry George in the Labor Party in New York and really admires that. He sees the Wild West show. There's all these things that are happening in his thinking, but one of the things that's happening is that he's going every week and talking to black workers and learning what's going to be successful in conversation with them and hearing from them what they think. And then I believe that they really help him both to craft the message, but then also to broadcast the message. Serra writes to La Fraternidad and vouches for him. That's really the beginning of the relationship. He speaks, and and then Marti writes a piece in the Saturday Evening Post, and Serra writes a piece in the Fraternidad saying, "Hey, check out this Marti guy." And then Marti writes to Serra and says, "Thank you so much for that. I know I haven't answered your messages before, but now I've seen what you've written, and I would like to really help you with La Liga." Right? And then there's the whole. So I think it's really important in Marti's development. And I think many of the things that Marti ends up saying are things that Serra had been saying before. And can I say that he didn't get it from any place else or that he didn't learn it? But so then when he's able to go and successfully in these miraculous collective effervescent acts of speaking for 2 nights straight in Tampa and all the workers come to his side, it's not just because of some transcendent national self inside. It's because he's learned how to do politics. And doing politics, he's decided, is going to be building coalitions. And building coalitions means listening to to allies like Serra who are going to help you build those coalitions. And then when he gets to Key West, the same thing. I think that the New Yorkers and the Tampa folks who have decided he's our guy, Marti's our guy. Marti's the way that we're going to take control of this movement. And they put him forward there and kind of skirt the Nationals' leadership in Key West by basically electing Marti to be their leader.
That's fascinating. Can I ask just one little more informational question? When you mentioned the Masonic lodges that the Cubans belong to, you mentioned Prince Hall.
Yeah.
And which of course is kind of contradictory because the liturgy is disavowing racial divisions, but Prince Hall existed in the U.S. because of segregation or discrimination, basically. So, did most of them go to Prince Hall lodges, or did some of them join other lodges that were and also, did they, as far as you can tell, have connections with Cuban Masonic lodges?
So I looked, and I have no evidence that any of the main characters on my book were in any of the multiracial lodges or the white-led lodges in New York. I don't have any evidence that they were not. I don't have anybody saying we can't stand these people because they talk about racelessness, but they never invite us. Or they invite us, but we're always being judged. Because one of the things about the lodges in the United States, it might be true in Cuba too, they were mutual aid societies. So people were very jealous about who you let in, because once you let somebody in, then they had benefits, right? So if you let somebody in who didn't work or didn't take care of their family, then you were on the hook for paying for those things, and that was a big set of conflicts. So I know that there are lodges that are ostensive that have these anti-racist liturgies and that seem to have at least, they don't mention race, so at least class diversity within them. And then I know that at the end of the 10 Years' War, there seems to be some fracture inside those lodges. And some people leave the lodges because they don't want to talk about racial equality and they want to disavow it. And some people are frustrated in the lodges because they want to create worker education centers and they can't get the lodge to support it. So there's clearly tensions there. That's around the same time that the Cubans of African descent create their own lodges. I can't tell you exactly what the process is, but I will say that I originally thought it was mostly about removing themselves from these mixed Cuban citizen areas, which might be repressive in some ways. But then I discovered that about half of them were already married to African American women, And the ones who found the lodge had already been initiated into African American lodges with the people who I presume are their fathers-in-laws and brothers-in-laws. So it actually might be an act of separation from the English-speaking black people with whom they're, right? Because they're creating a Spanish-speaking lodge for themselves. So what I end up coming to is that you have to understand that it's possible that they are simultaneously living in worlds, sometimes where they're just sharing around race, sometimes where they're sharing around nation and language, and sometimes where they only want to be with just each other.
Yeah.
Right, and that's like what I think those lodges end up being. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, my question has to do with Tampa. Would you know if this movement, this association, have any relations with the African Cuban organizations in Tampa? Because when Marti went to Tampa, he stayed in a black Cuban household.
Yeah.
He was heavily criticized, but he was overpraised. What I have read is that they influenced him tremendously in his Pino Nuevo's speech.
Yeah.
And I would like to know if they were associated with, because this is the midst of the Jim Crow, division in the.
No, I think absolutely they were. So, I mean, just for an example, Joaquin Granados, who's one of the leaders of La Liga in Tampa, and who also is was a labor activist and was involved in the nationalist organizations. He and Serra were doing work together in the 1870s in Matanzas. They were friends in Asociación de Color, and publishing a newspaper for the first time. So that you can see letters between them in the 1890s when Marti is going back and forth between these cities frequently. Serra and Granados are really, you can tell that they have this kind of connection. And one of the places that they have the connection is that they've been doing diasporic politics already for a decade, right? So when La Fraternidad is founded in Cuba and needs both distribution in the United States, but also support from the workers who have more money in the United States, when the New Yorkers create an organization to collect money, they say to their friends in Key West, you guys want to do it too? And they do it too. And some of the people who end up leading the organizations that Marti goes to in Tampa were those same people who had been distributing and raising money for La Fraternidad in Key West. And then also, there were correspondents to La Fraternidad. So they had already been involved in the transnational black civil rights movement in all of these places. And so that's why I think it's so important that when Marti comes to Tampa, the folks in Tampa have already read pamphlets and speeches by Serra praising Marti, right? Because they know who Serra is. And yet, by the end of the war, you can see that he is publishing in New York and writing letters to people in various parts of the rest of the exile communities, especially in Key West and in Tampa, trying to manage disagreements among various groups among the African descended people, because they're all in favor of civil rights doesn't mean they're all in the same direction as who should be leader or what the strategy should be. And Serra is trying to assert himself as a leader and say, you all need to get along because I need you to all be in the meeting to get together to support me. So there's definite, all that back and forth is there. One of the problems is that, in documenting, is that people kept every one of Marti's letters, and people kept every one of Juan Guadalupe Gomez's letters. So anybody who wrote to them or got written back to, you can see those relationships. But the letters among them, except for a few that Serra kept, you don't see all those letters. So I think there's a lot more that we're not seeing, telegraphs, letters, visitation, but you only kind of see it tangentially or through the newspapers. But I think definitely the answer is yes.
Yes, one first question. To what extent was NYPL collection Schomburg section useful to your research?
Yeah, well, so
most of the data are here in New York.
Yeah, so Arturo Schomburg, who founded the Schomburg collection, was a member of this community, right? So he was a member of that Masonic lodge, the Sol de Cuba Masonic Lodge. He was from Puerto Rico. He came in 1891. He lived in the same house with his mother, who came with him, who was also a midwife, lived in the same house as Juan Bonilla, who is the brother of Jerónimo Bonilla that we talked about. He was in these organizations. He was the secretary of one of the clubs. And where this whole project started was my original interest in him. When I talk about the people who move from one to the other, he started his life inside the movement around Marti, and he ended his life connected to Marcus Garvey and to the Harlem Renaissance. I started out trying to explain that transition, and I end up the project thinking there's no transition at all. All the people in New York in the 1890s would have totally understood what he was doing that whole time. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he ever understood himself as having left behind that earlier thing. In fact, some of the things that I used to cite as examples of him declaring international racial unity, he also says, as my friend José Martí would say, right? So he doesn't, I don't think he, now, I mean, I would have to go back and read more to make that complaint. So the project starts with the fact that that the Masonic Lodge documents from this Masonic Lodge are in the Schomburg because Schomburg was the secretary of that lodge. And that the only, as to my knowledge, the only one of the black revolutionary clubs from the Cuban Revolutionary Party for which we have the complete minutes books and membership lists that are outside of Cuba is the one that Schomburg had been the secretary and written down, and so he kept it, and so that's at the Schomburg Center. So that's where I started. It was only at the very end of the project that I got to access to the parallel ones that are in Cuba.
Is there a lot of data to be mined? Is
Pardon?
a lot of data to be mined yet?
Well, I think there's a lot to be still asked about the group of people who didn't go back. You asked about the people who go back. I still think there's a lot more to be done about the involvement of people who had been in exile, people of color who have been in exile who are then engaged in Cuban and Puerto Rican politics back on the islands after the U.S. intervention. But I do think that there's probably material at the Schomburg Center for thinking about what happens, let's say, after 1905 in New York.
Peñalver, he said.
Exactly. So musicians who stay, or new people who keep arriving. Two of the Maceo brothers were still living in New York in 1905. Right, working as cigar makers. Two of the younger brothers of Antonio José Maceo are living not that far from here actually. So I think there's a lot more in that period between the kind of the 1930s, which Guridi has talked about really well, and 1905. I think there's a lot of back and forth.
Are your relatives in that Florence?
Me?
Yeah. You had all your grandfather?
My grandfather was an engineer when they were building the canal. He was a locomotive engineer, and he drove the trains that carried the equipment to build the canal. Then they moved to Cuba. They were invited to the U.S. for the big wave of immigration, and he worked as an engineer in Cuba. So he came here with my grandmother and 6 children from Antilles, Cuba, to the U.S. But grandfather also he was a Mason, and he was with the Odd Fellows, and he worked here as a building engineer. When he applied for his citizenship, his boss helped him with his papers. That was in 1923. And in 1928, he got his naturalization papers, became a citizen. I have them when we have the family reunions. Everybody gets a copy with the names of all the children. And my father's mother brought him here from Havana, and he was 7. But he always wanted to go back to Havana. He went back, but then she brought him back again to the U.S. And he, when he was in his teens, he went into the New York National Guard. But he wasn't as active as my grandfather's side of the family. My grandfather was the Masons. He was with the Railroad Union.
Right.
The
Brotherhood of Railroad Workers.
What was it? The TW, was it the TWE? The Railroad Workers Union. And with the
Pullman Porters.
The Odd Fellows. And we had, the family had to belong to the lodge. It was called the Star of Hope Lodge. And that was in Harlem.
You could tell stories.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's amazing.
Because I was the first American. My father went into the military, the National Guard. That's how he got his citizenship. But my mother, through my grandfather's naturalization, became. But the thing was that when I was the first American in all sides of the family, on both sides of the family. So that's why I said so much fuss was made over me, because I was the first American in the family. And I didn't realize until I was in my teens that the 3 of us were products of immigrants. And no one could ever understand us because, I told them my name, well, where were you born? In Harlem, and none of them sort of go together. And, well, why do you speak Spanish? Well, my parents were immigrants, from Panama and Cuba. But you had a question, Mr. Font, about my grandfather, was it?
I want to see how you connect your family tradition or legacy connects to this story.
Oh, with
But I think you said enough because we don't have time.
Oh, okay. I'm not.
Well, you have anything to add?
Well, the thing is that I've been following the Cuban history because of my ancestry, but the most of my revelation came from the Bildner Center, and every time you had something on Cuba, I was interested because still writing, and doing history on it. And so when I saw this revolutionary nationalism in the Spanish Caribbean, I told several of my associates about it, and some of them are here today.
But we
so
thank
much.
you for being here. Last question.
Yes, thank you. The ugly side of the revolutions in the Antilles of the late 19th century is how Puerto Rico gave it all. There are many Puerto Ricans that fought and died. Among the principal was Juan Reyes Rivera, no?
Yeah.
And yet Cuba betrayed Puerto Rico. It's part of the reason why the United States was able to get away with annexing Puerto Rico. It is known, for instance, that there was an attempt to create a second front in Yauco that was financed by none other than Meterio Betances, and that Estrada Palma somehow vetoed it, derailed it, caused it to, for whatever machinations, perhaps machinations, thinking to find an independence for Cuba, doing Puerto Rico as a throwaway. My question, given that context, is what tie, if any, exists between José Celso Barbosa and this group?
Yeah.
He was a founder of the annexationist group.
Yeah.
Annexation is anything but revolutionary, anything but independent, anything but liberation for Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Even though Puerto Rico suffered 120 years of genocide in the United States.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So to start, I mean, I'm not going to argue with you that Estrada Palma did not support the idea of a second invasion, and that there was a real rift in New York between the leadership of the Puerto Rican side of the struggle, the Puerto Rican section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and the leadership of the Cuban side. At the same time, that there was increasing tension between the working class Cubans and Puerto Ricans and the leadership of both of those movements. And what I came to trying to trace through it in the people that I am able to focus on the most are the Puerto Ricans who were involved in building those clubs in the first place. Sotero Figueroa, Pachín Marín, Rosendo Rodriguez.
Absolutely fascinating.
So how did they get there in the first place? And then what do they do when they've built an alliance that's about being revolutionary, being working class, and being Afro-descended, and being racially progressive? And that's gonna unify the two islands. And then the leadership of both islands, who are not necessarily as committed to any of those projects, are splitting from each other too. And my sense is that although Figueroa never leaves the Puerto Rican struggle, he decides that the alliances he has with Serra and the Cubans who are making the right kind of revolution, what he sees as the right kind of revolution, are too strong, and that's why he ends up going to Cuba rather than to Puerto Rico. He in some ways, like in that conflict. And the paradox is that means that he ends up being part of Estrada Palma's coalition, right? So it's complicated. Celso Barbosa, it's a really interesting story. I ask that story all the time because he also is a really interesting figure. Celso Barbosa is a person who comes really from almost exactly the same background as many of the Puerto Rican people of color who are here in New York. So the one difference is that he's highly educated, right? So he comes from an artisan background. I think his father was a carpenter, if I'm not mistaken. Very much from the same world as Sotero Figueroa, Arturo Schomburg. He has the really good fortune of having enough family resources to be able to come and do a medical degree in the United States. He goes to the University of Michigan, where I teach. And then he went back, and he was definitely part of the same wing of the Autonomista Party as Figueroa and as Pachín Marín and as the others who come to New York. He never breaks with the party, but I mean, we could talk more after. But I think that there are still some resonances between the kinds of race politics that he's doing in that party and the kind that they're doing in the Cuban Revolutionary Party. And I think some of the tensions between him and the rest of the Autonomistas are around some of the same tensions that Figueroa and Marín had already identified with the white leadership that they were struggling against. Now, how to square the fact that he ends up strategically aligning himself with the U.S. occupation, that's way too big a topic. And also, I don't want to be the person to have the last word on it, but I'm happy to talk more about it afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Fascinating topic. I hope we go back to it. And the whole question of formation of the clubs, as you pointed out, that needs to be better explained, right?
Yeah.
And then the coalition formation through which that loose network of club joins the PRC. And before that, the independentistas, no?
Yeah.
That's something that you do some work on, but it's still there to be fully developed.
Sure.
Maybe you can do it.
Maybe, or someone else.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Jesse,
much
the
for
best
coming.
work.